Last year, on October 8th, the Jewish community felt alone. Jews across this country felt isolated, misunderstood, and abandoned by some of our historic allies. I made the mistake of going on social media that day, and the first thing I saw was a post by an imam, a friend, a colleague, someone who I'd worked with for years on interfaith dialogue and social justice issues. We'd lobbied in Harrisburg together for voting rights and public education funding and gun violence prevention. Meanwhile, his post on October 8th showed no concern for those killed on October 7th, and his post justified Hamas's actions as legitimate resistance. A pogrom is not legitimate resistance. Rape is not legitimate resistance. I had hoped on October 8th that I would hear from some of our interfaith allies. The imam didn't call me to check in. Did I have any family in Israel? Were they okay? In pain, I felt invisible to him. I was angry, still reeling from what I had seen on the news and heard from friends and family in Israel. I sent a text message to the imam that was pretty harsh. I didn't mince words. I asked him if he thought 9/11 was legitimate resistance too. I asked him what he would do if his friends and family were under attack. I probably should have slept on it before sending it, which is good advice to all of us. And then we didn't talk for a while. In true clergy joke irony, it took a pastor to bring us back together. The pastor invited us to join him at a faith leaders conference put on by the U.S. Department of Justice. And so, 2 months later, a pastor, an imam, and a rabbi walked into the National Constitution Center to learn about the dangers of white supremacy and homegrown terrorism. We learned about the shared threats to our houses of worship and the role that we can play in protecting one another. We learned how to spot and report hate crimes, and we learned that standing up for each other's safety is a powerful tool in combating extremism and hate. After the briefing, we had lunch together. We talked and we listened. We accepted that we are not going to agree about the politics of Israel and the Middle East, but we understood each other's pain a little better. I felt validated and seen when the imam recognized that a recent protest in Center City was indeed anti-Semitic. And it went a long way for him to understand that I do not blindly support the policies of the current Israeli government. In our fear, we had assumed the worst of each other. Most importantly, in that moment, we realized that while we have little effect on the politics of the Middle East, we can have a profound effect on our communities here in Philadelphia. That lunch did not solve all our problems, and some of our multi-faith relationships are still strained. But at the National Constitution Center that day, the three of us agreed that we would not let mistrust and fear divide our multi-faith, multi-racial coalition. We have spent years building bridges, and today, in this season, we need those bridges more than ever. Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav taught, Kol ha'olam kulo, gesher tsar ma'od. The whole world is a very narrow bridge, and the most important part is not to be afraid. The bridge really does feel pretty narrow right now. The isolation and abandonment that so many American Jews understandably feel makes us want to put up walls and give up on bridge building. But Nachman is saying, don't let that fear cloud your judgment. Don't let that fear take control of you. Don't act on that fear. Nachman's metaphor feels so tangible. It's like we have to walk this tightrope. And when we look to the left and when we look to the right, all we see is danger, a deep chasm that feels insurmountable. But that narrow bridge is all we have. And we need those bridges for our own protection and for the good of our country, because our Jewish safety is inextricably linked to the safety of other communities and to the future of our inclusive democracy. I recently had the chance to learn from activist Eric Ward, a true ally to the Jewish community and a nationally recognized expert on authoritarian movements, hate-filled violence, and inclusive democracy. As a Black man, Ward has been on a mission to help all Americans understand the interconnectedness of hate. He sees anti-Semitism at the core of dangerous authoritarian thinking like that of white supremacists who believe that this country should be an all-white nation free of people of color and Jews. Eric Ward writes, "Anti-Semitism is so central to white nationalism that I became convinced people of color and other marginalized groups will never win our freedom if we're not also active in the struggle to uproot this form of anti-Jewish hate. Jews are cast in the same role that they've always filled for anti-Semites, as the absolute other," end quote. Ward explains that for white nationalists, it is that fantasy of that invisible Jewish power that explains how Black Americans, who in their eyes are supposedly racial inferiors, could orchestrate the end of Jim Crow. And for white nationals, it is that fantasy of invisible Jewish power that explains how feminists and the LGBT community could upend traditional gender roles. When the Tree of Life shooter said Jews were committing a genocide against white people, he was using that language that is so intimately familiar with white supremacists. Anti-Semitism is at the core of white nationalist thinking, and Jews are not the only victim. Black shoppers in a Buffalo supermarket were killed by a mass shooter who believed that he was in a war with Jews. The worshipers killed at a Black church in South Carolina, or the Latino shoppers murdered in Walmart in El Paso. For white supremacists, there is no difference. Jewish, Black, Latino, gay, we are all an affront to their vision of America. We are connected. Kol ha'olam kulo, gesher tsar ma'od, v'ha'ikar lo lefached klal. It's not easy to walk that bridge right now, but as Rabbi Nachman reminds us, we must not be afraid. We need to keep building bridges. As we become more divided as a nation, our bridges are the one thing that keep us connected, but those bridges are being stretched like never before. White nationalists, extremists, authoritarians, they feed off this polarization. In a recent webinar for rabbis from across the country, Justin Florence, director of Protect Democracy, taught how democracy has been eroding across the globe since 2007, especially in America, where we have seen a frightening surge in authoritarianism in recent years. The authoritarian playbook is fairly similar across regimes, and Protect Democracy defines 5 characteristics that may sound a little bit familiar. First, spreading disinformation. Autocracies create confusion about what's true and what's not, and use disinformation and propaganda to divide us and further their goals. Quashing dissent through cracking down on legitimate protest or limiting the media. Stoking violence. They rile up private militias and use that violence to intimidate their opponents. Fourth, scapegoating vulnerable communities. Communities like ours, in order to build their own political power and pit minority communities against each other. And lastly, corrupting elections. Our elections are not fully free and fair. They are disenfranchising voters and creating unnecessary roadblocks to voting. This is not hypothetical. We are seeing this very rise in authoritarianism in America at the expense of our democratic ideals. And to answer the age-old question, is it good for the Jews? No. No, it is not. It is not good for us. It is not good for anyone in America. The best defense against authoritarianism is to build bridges across lines of difference to combat the hate that affects us all. Jews make up just 2.5% of this country. We are too small to go it alone. But we are often pitted against other minorities. White supremacists want us to fight, and they are using anti-Semitism as a wedge to drive apart these historic multiracial, multi-faith coalitions. Take DEI, for example, the diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some would have us believe that DEI departments have contributed to anti-Semitism on campus. While it is clear that there are gaps in knowledge in some DEI departments, especially in the area of anti-Semitism, rather than fight DEI, let's ensure that DEI has a wonderful, good knowledge of anti-Semitism. Road of Shalom was honored to host Dr. Valerie Harrison, Vice President of DEI at Temple University, for our congregational Passover Seder this past year. It was an opportunity for her to learn about our historic oppression and about anti-Semitism today. We have spent years building bridges, and we need to keep building them. But it doesn't mean it's always going to be easy. It will be uncomfortable. It has been uncomfortable this year. We cannot tolerate anti-Semitism, but I believe it's okay to stay in a setting even when we are uncomfortable, because the benefits outweigh the bad. Because building bridges means we have an opportunity to also educate others. We need to help others understand anti-Semitism and why the fight against anti-Semitism is inherent to their own safety and to our democracy. If we can overcome our fears and stay on that bridge, walking together, we can educate. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, known as AOC, was recently in dialogue with Amy Spitalnik, the head of JCPA, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, to better understand anti-Semitism. The two do not agree on all issues, especially in regards to Israel. But for Spitalnik, engaging new partners in the fight against anti-Semitism, white supremacy, and extremism comes first. After deep listening and dialogue with Spitalnik, AOC said, I quote, "Anti-Semitism, hate, and violence against Jews because of their identity is real and it is dangerous. When the Jewish community is threatened, the progressive movement is undermined," end quote. And guess what happened? Just a day after that conversation between Spitalnik and AOC, there was an anti-Semitic event in her very district, and the representative called it out strongly and publicly. The bridges work. Our communities are stronger when we are in dialogue and partnership. We have a unique opportunity in just over a week to hear from Amy Spitalnik. She's going to join us in conversation about civic participation in polarizing times as part of our Broad Perspectives speaker series. And then, continuing on the theme of protecting our democracy, join us a week later on Tuesday, October 29th, for our Get Out the Vote phone banking. RAC PA, the Pennsylvania branch of our Social Justice Religious Action Center, is phone banking every week through Election Day with partners. We are doing wide-scale voter education and voter turnout, especially in underserved Black and Latino communities across Pennsylvania. We are calling voters with nonpartisan encouragement to vote. I was going to give one more opportunity to participate in our democracy and invite you all to take some postcards on your way out, to write to voters in order to encourage them to vote. However, I have good news and bad news. The good news is the last service took all 600 of them. So the bad news is you don't get to write those letters, but there'll be other opportunities to be engaged. Kol haolam kulo gesher tsar ma'od, v'ha'ikar lo lefached klal. The whole world is a very narrow bridge, but the most important part, Nachman reminds us, is not to be afraid. It's so easy to let our fear take control of us because it's a scary bridge these days. But we must resist those instincts to stay on our side and not walk the path together. Our safety is bound up in the safety of other minority communities across this country, and our path forward is one of deep partnership and solidarity. I keep thinking of that famous picture of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. walking arm in arm with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel in Selma, Alabama, across the Edmund Pettus Bridge almost 60 years ago. They were marching for justice and for voting rights. We have spent years building bridges. It's now time to reinvest in those bridges, to do the hard work together against extremism and hate, and to build a just, democratic future for our country. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will. Amen.